and we shall start.
Think you want to mute us all, right? Because we're getting some feedback noise.
Are you? Yeah, I can. Marvin, you're muted. Well, hello, everyone. Today is December 15th, 2018. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman for the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today is the fourth in a series of webinars on the topic of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. It is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Its author and chairman of the committee is Neil Waldrop, for whom I am turning the facilitation of this webinar over to right now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. I am delighted once again to be here. I welcome everyone to the fourth webinar on this topic. Before I go beyond this, please let me make a procedural statement. This will be the final webinar before the year-end holidays. We will resume in January. We have not yet chosen the precise date of continuing. So I will send out a notice to everyone who is on the mailing list of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, and that will be very clear. For those of you who may not have the underlying document to hand, I recommend that you download it. This is the document Revelation Revealed, and you will be able to understand our discussion much better if you have the document available. You may download it from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. The link that connects with the document is toward the bottom of the homepage. on that website. Now, one of the characteristics of the streaming on YouTube is that it is not interactive. People who are viewing our broadcast on YouTube do not have the ability to ask a question. So if you would like to ask a question, I offer you an alternative. You can send us an email message containing your question, and you would send it to the following email address that is listed at the bottom of the homepage for the Committee for the Global Endeavor. It is as follows: info@globalendeavor.net. By way of explanation, I would say to you, not only in the link to the website, but also in this address, Global Endeavor is treated as one word without a hyphen, without any dot in the middle of it. In connection with questions, what we will do is collect a certain number of them that we find interesting, and we will deal with them in a panel discussion in some future broadcast. We do not guarantee that we will answer every question, and we reserve the right to edit the wording in ways we consider appropriate and effective. Now, enough of that procedural series of announcements. We will proceed to the substantive discussion for today. In principle, we are currently in the middle of page 92 of Revelation Revealed, immediately before formal question number 61. But before we get there, we will complete the discussion of 10 statements about salvation that I previously circulated to the participants. These are statements that have often been associated with traditional Christianity. We can understand the word salvation as meaning survival into the afterlife. In fairness, it is important to note that no single branch or denomination of Christianity proclaims or promotes every single statement on the list of 10. Although these statements are reasonably representative, at least in terms of their spirit and overtones, it is best to interpret them as examples. So in the broadcast last week on December 8th, we discussed and evaluated questions 1, 2, and 3. We will now proceed to discuss questions 4 through 10. And the possible reactions to these questions are as follows: a rating of A, true; a rating of B, mainly true but partly false; a rating of C, mainly false but partly true; a rating D, false; and a possible rating X, cannot be evaluated. Now, last week we were blessed by the participation of one person who was not able to be here today, Charles Olivier. And Charles sent me a message during the week in which he regretted that he was going to be occupied today, and gave me his net answers to the questions 4 through 10, the ones remaining on our list. I would like to group questions 4, 5, and 6, which is the grouping of the next series of questions that we have in front of us. And just for the information of the panelists, and perhaps to remind them, and for the information of people watching the streaming, Charles Olivier rated all 3 of these questions, 4, 5, and 6, as category D, namely false. The questions are quite similar. They all start with the same initial wording, which is as follows: everyone who believes in Jesus will be saved, will survive into the afterlife, and then the word but appears. In the case of question 4, the statement following the word but is but only if he or she has been properly baptized. In statement 5, it goes on a little farther, but only if he or she has been properly baptized and has accepted the doctrines and teachings that the church proclaims. In statement 6, it goes on even farther, saying, but only if he or she has been properly baptized, has accepted the doctrines and teachings that the church proclaims, and has kept the commandments, although he or she may have sinned from time to time. Now, to repeat, the front end of these three statements is the same. Everyone who believes in Jesus will be saved, will survive into the afterlife, and then we have a series of conditions followed by, expressed by the phrase, but only if. I think it is best to treat these three statements as a group, if we can. And in effect, what they indicate in an order of progression is an increasing set of conditions that the group of believers, which we commonly call the church, have at times interpreted or established. Before we go to the questions, I would like to read two paragraphs from part 4 of the Urantia book, both of them by the Midweyer Commission. The first paragraph is from section 2 of paper 153. It is part of Jesus's discourse during the crisis at Capernaum. I will read it as follows. This is Jesus speaking. Some of you, when you could not find me after the feasting of the multitude on the other side, hired the Tiberias fishing fleet, which a week before had taken shelter nearby during a storm, to go in pursuit of me. And what for? Not for truth and righteousness, or that you might the better know how to serve and minister to your fellow men. No, but rather that you might have more bread for which you had not labored. It was not to fill your souls with the word of life, but only that you might fill the belly with the bread of ease. And long have you been taught that the Messiah, when he should come, would work those wonders which would make life pleasant and easy for all the chosen people. It is not strange, then, that you who have been thus taught, should long for the loaves and the fishes. But I declare to you that such is not the mission of the Son of God. I have come to proclaim spiritual liberty, teach eternal truth, and foster living faith. Once again, this is from section 2 of paper 153, The Crisis at Capernaum. The second paragraph, a little bit shorter, is from paper 175, entitled The Last Temple Discourse. It is specifically paragraph 12 in section 1 of paper 175, whereupon, once again, Jesus is speaking and he says as follows. Woe upon you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You would shut the doors of the kingdom of heaven against sincere men because they happen to be unlearned in the ways of your teaching. You refuse to enter the kingdom and at the same time do everything within your power to prevent all others from entering. You stand with your backs to the doors of salvation and fight with all who would enter therein. The end of the paragraph. Now, I have read these two paragraphs because they have a common element. The common element is spiritual liberty that Jesus was proclaiming. And in the second case, a challenge to the group, in that case, the scribes and Pharisees, who were limiting access to God's favor by virtue of their teachings. So I would now like to turn to that series of questions that I described before and ask for your willingness to treat them as a group. Is that acceptable? Does anyone wish to object to linking questions 4, 5, and 6 together? I see no objection. Since I saw you nodding first, Marvin, we can credit you with quick reactions, and I will turn to you for the first answer.
Well, my reaction to all three questions is partially true, dependent on how you understand the term believe in Jesus. And I guess I think the term believe in Jesus is most commonly used, frankly, in a misleading and superficial sense. So I'll just categorize them all as false throughout. And in commenting, I'll make a couple of comments. One is I don't think it has anything to do with believing in the church as an institution or any institution or any set of institutional proclamations, doctrinal or otherwise. And what I would do is draw our attention to the last statement in the first paragraph that you read, Neil. And that sentence is, I have come to proclaim spiritual liberty, comma, teach eternal truth, comma, and foster living faith. None of those things have much to do with mere belief.
Thank you. I much appreciate how you brought in the net message of that passage that I read to you earlier. Doreen, I'd like to turn to you now for your reactions to these three questions.
Well, I know survival depends on your decisions and more decisions and the idea of how to build your soul through love and your faith. So, you know, I had to look up some of these things about baptism. Like, what does the water have to do with anything that's going to bring you closer to God? And I read an awful lot of stuff. It was really amazing what they say about all these things. And so the spirits live in the water, the good spirits, you know, chase away. But the interesting thing is I saw something, a movie where not too long ago on Netflix, where they on some primitive place in the Pacific, and they baptized this woman who they thought was filled with evil spirits. And they filled her with water for hours and hours, and she died. She was a young woman. So this misplaced understanding of the primitive ways of thinking has nothing at all to do with God, repeating rituals constantly. I thought, oh my goodness, you know, where did this all come from? But it came from really such old religious beliefs that were so primitive, but no, we know better anyway now, since we have the Urantia book. But even if I didn't have the book, I would think I could not understand how sprinkling holy water, what makes it holy, you know, I don't know. There's just so much to talk about, you know, when it comes to this, but it's really the supreme desire to be like God, to grow your soul, and that's survival. That's all. Unfaltering faith.
Thank you. Since each one of these three questions begins with the condition properly baptized, and since you have rejected that, your remarks imply that you are treating all three of these statements as false, as indeed Marvin did. And that's how I will record your answer. Steve?
Well, I've been thinking about this exercise, I guess, and I'm choosing not to participate in it any further. I don't believe that it's Jesusonian to do this kind of thing. It also goes against the teaching of the Urantia book that tells us to appropriate the best of other religions and other people's beliefs and leave the rest behind. So we should be investigating why the Urantia book says there's enough in Christianity to immortalize it. We should be figuring out what they meant by that and highlighting what is best about Christianity, not making ourselves feel superior by highlighting what is worst about Christianity. So I object to this whole exercise on principle.
Thank you. I will understand your reaction as effectively amounting to X, cannot be evaluated, and will so record you not only for the three questions that I have just asked about, but for the ensuing 4, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And even though what you have said seems to be an extreme reply. I treasure your right to say this and the pluralism and diversity that we are seeking to epitomize during these broadcasts. That now makes me turn to the remaining person, my esteemed collaborator and the vice chairman of the committee, Bob DeBolt.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I see all three of these as necessary before the but and sufficient. So if you read 4, 5, and 6, you'd say, okay, in some cases, everyone who believes in Jesus will be saved. That would be necessary to survive into the afterlife, and it's sufficient, but only if he or she has been properly baptized. And 5 just gets a little bit more on the sufficiency side, and 6 does the same thing. Pretty much D, as far as I'm concerned. I go back to what I was saying, I think when I answered 1 and 2, and that what I've learned from the Rancher Papers is that there's a huge process that has been set up in the grand universe that goes into Havona, that goes through Havona, that goes into paradise and then back out. And theoretically, with some speculation, will be in the master universe. I hope I said grand universe to begin with, because that's what I meant. So in process wise, whether I choose to discern or to parse the word believe or saved, just from my understanding of how the grand universe educational system works, and also from the spiritual teachings that I've got now in the scaffolding from the Rancher Papers, that these can't be true statements. Over.
Thank you. So I believe, if I am correct, that you mark all of these 3 as D.
I do.
Yes. Marvin, you want to come back?
Yeah, I did have a thought in response to what Steve mentioned, but I don't know if it's appropriate. If you want to continue with simply evaluating these questions, but I think I do have a comment on what he shared, so I'll leave it to you.
Thank you for giving me the flexibility, Marvin. And what I propose to do is to go through the remaining questions 7 through 10, and then I will recognize you for these additional remarks.
Thanks.
Okay. Question 7 comes out of the history of Christianity. It is a translation into English based on a statement that was originally made in Latin. The version in English reads as follows: outside the church, there is no salvation. And I suppose I'm obliged to do my best with the wording in Latin that somebody who has studied the language might be able to understand, but then again, might not. It goes, extra ecclesiam nulla salus. In English, outside the church, there is no salvation. Would you like to take that, Marvin?
I think it's false.
Okay.
D, yeah. Man, and I'll simply say there are millions upon millions of sincere religionists who I expect to see on the mansion worlds who are not Christians.
Thank you. Bob?
Ditto. I can't say anything other than that. D.
Thank you. Doreen?
The only thing I would say is that that's one way of controlling people through fear, and it's, so of course it's absurd.
Thank you. I will now share a story about myself when I was 12 years old. It relates exactly to this phrase, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, outside the church there is no salvation. I was brought up in a family with one parent, my mother, being Roman Catholic, and the other parent, my father, being Protestant. He had promised that all his children would be raised as Roman Catholics, and he kept his promise. He didn't like it, but he kept his promise. In any event, the story is as follows. At age 12, I went to a priest who had been involved in my education as a consultant. He was not my teacher, but he was a consultant in the Roman Catholic parochial school that I was attending. And I said at the time, Father, I don't understand. My own father is a good man, but we have this saying outside the church, meaning the Roman Catholic Church, there is no salvation. How could that be? I can't accept that. And the priest said, well, my son, I can understand your concern. We would say that if your father is a good man and does everything his conscience tells him, that he has the baptism of desire, and therefore he really is inside the church, even though he may not know it. So you, his son, do not need to worry about this. I greatly appreciated that answer at the time, but it was an extremely inventive way of getting around the problem that, in effect, his institution had created by adopting this slogan in the first place.
Very nice.
Thank you, Doreen. He was one of my favorite priests at the time, and I think you can understand why he was. Now, the succeeding two questions have to do with being condemned to hell. And in both cases, it has to do with believing. The question, statement 8 is, anyone who does not believe in Jesus will be condemned to hell. Statement 9, anyone who does not believe in God will be condemned to hell. Bob, would you take these, please?
Sure, D on both of those. Obviously, there's no such place, object, concept as hell. Maybe hell is earth. I don't know. You're at you, but no, both of them are D.
Doreen?
Yeah, I agree. It's funny because I had read, it said the Archbishop of Toledo was charged with heresy just for eating meat on a forbidden day. Could you imagine that? And denying the existence of purgatory. So the church became the judge, the jury, and the executioner. I agree, with Bob. Of course, there's no hell. So it's not an attractive thing to be given, all these negative statements. And how would I want to belong to, an institution that doesn't speak of love or something to your heart? It's really, it leaves a lot to be desired. Because they used to also say to the Muslims and the Jews, if you don't believe, then you're going to, you're die. So they say, I believe. Otherwise, it's death. It's death either way. What? So that was the crypto religions.
Thank you, Marvin. Marvin, you're muted.
Sorry, can you read the statement again?
The two statements are fundamentally the same. The first one is, anyone who does not believe in Jesus will be condemned to hell. The second one, anyone who does not believe in God will be condemned to hell.
So I'm going to say I can understand that two different ways. Well, one is superficially, and then it's utterly false because there is no hell from my point of view. But in a more sophisticated sense, and in keeping with the spirit of what Steve was talking about, I've had conversations with Christians who basically understand hell as a state of separation from God. And whether you understand Jesus as being God, or speaking of the universal Father, I have sympathy with the statement that those who have no sense of God and essentially functionally are separated from God. In other words, they live their lives without actual relationship with that presence within, are in hell. They're in a state of functional hell. They're suffering, and they're often demoralized and confused, and sometimes even suicidal. So in a deeper sense, I would say that there's some truth to the statement. And I've encountered sophisticated Christians who have that point of view.
Well, for the purposes of keeping tabs on your net reactions, I am not sure that you would like me to mark you as D, false. What would you say with a rating of C, mainly false but partly true? Would that be closer to your views?
No, I'd say for the purposes of this discussion as it's been framed, put me in D, and then I'll share a thought on the purposes of the discussion, which a little later.
Thank you. So this leaves only statement 10, which in effect earlier comments of Doreen have already rejected by implication. Statement 10 reads as follows: baptism is necessary in order to remove the stain of original sin that contaminates each infant because of the misconduct of Adam and Eve. So Doreen, I believe that your previous remarks indicate a view that this statement is false. Am I correct?
Well, it's to appease the spirits, you know, and to buy off bad luck. And that's how I kind of, you know, interpreted, said, you know, the Greeks believed the spirits lived in the water, so they did the baptism first in Jesus' name, and then in the Father and the Son and the Spirit. And it was all required for admission into, you know, into the fellowship of believers. But he said, you know, he didn't repent for sins. He just followed the ritual of the times. And I think that's exactly probably what the people did at that time. And it was just an acceptable thing. But yeah, I do reject it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so you do end up at D, as I thought you would.
Yeah.
Yes, fine. Bob?
Yeah, I find that, well, D, I find this statement as interesting as the question that you gave me related to does a judge condemn someone else because of someone else's or an individual because of someone else's misconduct? And I think this falls into the same category. You know, it's patently false for this one, and it's a ritual. Kind of interesting that a ritual, as Doreen was speaking there, of you know, historical belief in water cleansing, and water does cleanse, of course, you know, on the material side, but how it reaches into the mystical is fairly interesting, that this would be something that would turn out to be true for someone else. So I have to say D again, of course.
Thank you. Marvin, I believe that you are the one remaining panelist who has not yet given his judgment, his rating on this statement. So now it's your turn.
I'm sorry, Neil. I do have to ask you to just read it again real quickly.
This has to do with the necessity for baptism. It reads, baptism is necessary in order to remove the stain of original sin that contaminates each infant because of the misconduct of Adam and Eve.
Yeah, false, pretty much in its entirety. All the premises in it are just incorrect.
Thank you.
My point of view.
I'm sorry, did you finish your thought?
No, just from my point of view.
Yes, sir. That's what we're doing. We're giving our own individual points of view. Mm-hmm. Once again, as I stated earlier, and as I've said many times before, we are sharing opinions, we are exchanging views, we are demonstrating, and indeed, in my opinion, epitomizing a spirit of pluralism and diversity, and that's the point. Now, I would like to recognize you, Marvin, for your comments that you stated you wish to express concerning the remarks that Steve made earlier.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. And first of all, I want to say I very deeply appreciate the atmosphere and the culture of the conversation that this context that you've created, and the breadth of the conversation. And so I think it allows for a view like the one expressed by Steve, and I think that's great. What I would add in response to what Steve said is, for me, there's an interesting question of who is our audience in this conversation. Who is our audience? Who are we speaking to? and what is our purpose as we converse. And my assumption, because I've spoken as if this is the case, is that our audience is entirely a group of Urantia book readers and no one else. And our purpose is to elucidate things that are already in the Urantia book. But frankly, my sense is that we're a little bit preaching to the choir with particularly with these kinds of questions, because they're so obvious. And so if it were a different and larger audience, particularly including non-Urantia book readers and Christians, I'm not sure it would be a purposeful conversation, because we would be doing what Steve was talking about, which is essentially negating the value and validity of another religion. And Jesus didn't engage in that function. And I think that our larger audience was who we were addressing, what we would be doing would be what Jesus was trying to engage in, which is look for truth, expand upon it, and allow it to slowly, steadily, naturally crowd out what was of error, rather than directly criticizing it. So it's just an interesting philosophical point about the nature of our conversation and our audience.
Thank you. If the rest of you are patient with me in my role as the moderator and also as the author of the underlying document, Revelation Revealed, I will then try to respond as best I can to the points that Steve made and those that Marvin just made. Yes, I agree with Marvin that our audience is readers of the Urantia book, and I would say predominantly committed readers of the Urantia book, not simply casual readers. There is nothing that would impede someone of another faith, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever, from looking at our programs. If he or she wishes to do so, they're available and will remain available on YouTube. But I think the message that we have, the message that we are exploring, is of greatest interest to committed readers of the Urantia book. And thus, if they are not our entire audience, they are the overwhelming majority of it. Now, the context of these questions comports with the title of the document, Revelation Revealed. And it was my task in writing that document to try to dig deeply into what the revelators were telling us, to overcome misunderstandings possibly, and indeed to reveal aspects of the teachings of the Urantia book that, in my judgment, had not received enough attention up to now. So the word revealed in the second half of the title has to do with making known, whereas revelation, the first word, even though it is a linguistic cognate, has to do with the spiritual purpose that the revelators were undertaking. So if my purpose in writing that document was to reveal aspects that were not appropriately understood, then you can go through the 12 topics that the document covers and interpret the meaning of each of these topics. In other words, I was seeking to point out aspects that need to be understood better, at least from my perspective. Now we get to the question in front of us. Topic 8 is as follows: comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. If we are going to compare and contrast, it is necessary first to start with the true teachings of Jesus and then go through, as best we can, at least some of the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. And I believe that these 10 statements that I compiled do embody the general spirit and overtones of some statements that have been made by various Christian believers throughout the history of Christianity. Therefore, I believed when I made up the 10 statements, and believe now, that evaluating these statements is part of the overall task of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. It is not my purpose to conduct a crusade directed against organized institutional Christianity. That was not why I wrote this material. That is not why we are discussing it. But it is important to try to point out the differences, the comparison and the contrast, because I am not certain that committed readers of the Urantia book have absorbed these differences with the care that would behoove them. And that's part of our purpose today, not only to exchange views, but perhaps to provide additional grist for reflection on the part of committed readers of the Urantia book in the event that one of us or several of us say something that they find interesting or useful, and preferably both interesting and useful. That at least is my aspiration, and I hope that I have answered your points. I will now turn to Steve and ask for him to react on anything that I have just said, or possibly anything that Marvin has just said.
Well, I would say that what you've done here is reinforce what most of your Urantia book readers already believe about Christianity. In the Urantia book community, the ideas that you've highlighted are already quite prevalent. If you really wanted to highlight something that your Urantia book readers don't appreciate, it's what Christianity and the Urantia book have in common. That is a topic that needs elucidation, and I will put Doreen's comments as an example of what Urantia book readers believe for the most part. And so if you really wanted to elucidate hidden parts of the Urantia book, I would say do the exact opposite of what you've been doing. And I also just think that there's a real bias in how you've presented Christianity. You've highlighted the absolute most negative things you could find, and I agree they're negative things, and I agree they're false, but I object to the, I called it in a letter that I wrote to you, it's a caricature of a caricature. The Urantia book was written in the 1920s and 1930s, and the primary theological understanding of Christianity and of St. Paul is reflected directly in these quotations, and they're very much disagreed with now by most theologians and historians. And so it ends up to be a very inappropriate and harmful way of presenting the Urantia book to non-Urantia book readers. It would be as if somebody opened up the Urantia book and made a YouTube video about the race papers and some of the more outrageous statements that are made in the race papers and presented that as the essence of the Urantia book. We would not think that to be very fair, and being pretty familiar with the history of Christian spirituality and theology, I think you've highlighted only negative things and no positive things. And for instance, the idea of hell as annihilation, as Marvin spoke about earlier, was actually developed in the 3rd century by a Christian theologian. So that is not a new idea. That is a very old idea in Christianity, and as are many other ideas that are in keeping with Jesus' teachings. But you haven't highlighted that at all. So that's why I object to this whole exercise.
Thank you. First, I uphold your right to express the views, and I treasure them. I believe that each of you contributes to the diversity of this discussion, and I welcome Steve's comments as that kind of a contribution. For the purposes of clarity, I would identify the comments that Steve just made as relating to the excerpts from the Urantia book that appear on pages 91 and 92, one of them from the Midwear Commission, and another one from the Divine Counselor in paper 4. And so his comments have to do with contesting the accuracy and validity of those comments by the revelators. I believe that at least in that portion of his comments, he was not restricting his remarks to me personally or to my editing of the document. If you go farther into the section on topic 8, you will find quotations and excerpts which do depict positive elements of Christianity, and we will indeed have an opportunity to develop our own comments and views of those positive elements. Doreen, I saw you seeming to move to motion that you wish to speak, please.
Yeah, just briefly to say that I do appreciate the diversity of thinking, and I have no problem whether where you're coming from. I think it's all acceptable. But I like what Marvin said, as far as hell, and I understand it. You know, there's perspectives from each of us coming from our different walks of life, and I think it's so healthy to, if you're just talking off the top of your head and saying, well, this is what I believe, and that's what you're asking us, a personal feeling about these quotations. But it's okay. Actually, I enjoyed it because it forced me to look up a lot of the stuff, what it means, because just to say what I think it means is one thing, but when I did the research from Old Testaments and the New Testament and other philosophy, there was sort of an agreement on a lot of the stuff. And I think it's okay, because if we don't express the diversity, then we're not rubber stamps. And I'm not afraid to, even if you challenge me with what I believe, that's okay. I don't care. I think it's great. It's great to exchange these ideas. Anyway, I'll stop. Thank you. Thank you all.
Marvin, you want to come back in?
Yeah, I'll just say, I'll try and be brief. I really appreciate, Neil, that your tolerance for this kind of conversation that allows for Steve's point of view to be expressed. And I think that in and of itself is part of the experiment that you're engaging in here. I see a lot of value in what Steve shared, and I see a lot of value in your posing the situation that elicited that response. And I think it's very good education for the Urantia community to hear this whole interchange.
Thank you. And I would say that I very much appreciate what you've just said. The technique of the document is intended to spur thought, and our discussions are intended to spur thought. The context of open-ended questions, of which we're going to find one just in the middle of page 92, frankly, is intended, on my part, to leave many of them unresolved, to leave some doubt or wonder about how to answer these questions. My purpose, intellectually and from a literary perspective, has to do with the fact that if a question is answered decisively once and for all, then the matter is closed. That's not the point. The point is to show that there are different ways of looking at these questions. And from a very practical perspective, if the answer isn't fully resolved, then people who are viewing this series of webinars or who may be reading the document by itself have additional reasons to continue thinking about the questions. And frankly, it is this process of thinking and reflecting that is the core of what I was attempting to achieve by writing Revelation Revealed as a whole, on the understanding that the purpose of Revealed has to do with highlighting aspects of the teachings that may not have been adequately understood in the past by readers of the Urantia book. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for these comments. I believe now that we have reached a useful point of at least understanding each other's viewpoints to the degree that we understand the motivations that have led to the expressions of these viewpoints. And I think we also have done exactly what I was just trying to describe. We have left the issue open for viewers to ponder and think about. And frankly, that is a key part of my substantive goals for this webinar and for those that will follow. All right, with all of this in mind, if you can keep it all in mind at once, you'll be doing very well. I will now turn to formal question 61 that appears in the middle of page 92. And just for the sake of viewers who may not be familiar with the document and the way that I've organized it, the spontaneous questions that we've been discussing are questions on which the participants, the panelists, have not always had an opportunity to prepare. They knew that you know the pages that we were going to address, but there is no way for you to know the spontaneous questions that I am going to ask or the comments of others that are going to lead to further answers. Whereas in contrast, the formal questions surrounded by a blue box framing them are in front of you. They have been in front of you. And I believe that each of you makes a practice of developing a concerted, thoughtful answer, the answer that you intend to give when indeed I ask one of these formal questions that are printed in the text. So here we are, question 61. When the Divine Council declares that, quote, the inhabitants of Urantia are to find deliverance from these ancient errors, in paragraph 6 of section 5 of paper 4, is he essentially predicting that most human beings will eventually accept the teachings of the Urantia book? Are you willing to predict that any institution or religion whose leaders proclaim Jesus as the Son of God will abandon its core doctrine that he died on the cross to redeem mankind and atone for our sins? Bob, you haven't had a chance to talk for a while, so I turn to you.
Okay, thanks, Neil. For those that are listening, let me make a correction. The 456, paper 4, section 5, paragraph 6 is what's noted, and actually it's in paragraph 7.
Sorry.
But I do want to point out that there's 3 paragraphs there, and if you'll indulge me, I'd like to read all 3 of those, because I think that the deliverance idea is really the most important term here. So I'll take a second just to go back to so there's some pretty good synonyms for deliver. That's to release, to liberate, to rescue. So that's the context that that I'm taking this. And I think that if we look at the paragraph that was read, that Marvin read last week, that ends with "what a travesty upon the infinite character of God." So there's that strong, this is not so good, guys, by the Divine Counselor. But when we get to this particular section, let me point out these 3 paragraphs. Paragraph 456. I'm sorry, 455 talks about the deliverance of the Hebrews, and it says that the Hebrews believed that without the shedding of blood there could be no remission of sin. They had not found deliverance from the olden pagan idea that the gods could not be appeased except by the sight of blood. Though Moses did make distinct advance when he forbade human sacrifices and substituted, therefore, in the primitive minds of his childlike Bedouin followers, the ceremonial sacrifices of animals. And then, so sandwiching that particular paragraph about where the Divine Counselor says, "what a travesty upon the infinite character of God." That's the next one. I won't read that one. Down at the bottom of this, then, it says, "but the inhabitants of Urantia." So what's on the top of that statement, that paragraph, is talking about the past and the first century, and even goes back to Moses. Now it's saying, "but the inhabitants of Urantia are to find deliverance from these ancient errors, and pagan superstitions respecting the nature of the universal Father. This language is now moved into the fifth epochal revelation terminology a little bit more for me. The revelation of the truth about God is appearing, and the human race is destined to know the universal Father in all that beauty of character and loveliness of attributes so magnificently portrayed by the Creator Son who sojourned on Urantia as the Son of Man and the Son of God. So the paragraph at the end of this puts some great hope out here. It states that this revelation and the truth about God, and it uses the terms universal Father together, which I think is an upstepping from the fourth epochal revelation. So the question then is, when the divine counselor declares that the inhabitants of Urantia are to find deliverance from these ancient errors, is he essentially predicting that most human beings will eventually accept the teachings of the Urantia book? Let me make an unequivocal yes and no, unambiguous yes and no. I don't think I have ever really felt that the Urantia book has teachings. It has revelation. You know, I got to thinking about what Steve said earlier about the statement that the Midwayers make about Christianity has enough in it to immortalize itself. Well, that's not necessarily a teaching. That's a revelation or a scaffolding of a revelation that then allows us to do what we're doing here today, and that is to try to pick that apart a little bit and take our many years of studying the book and our past experiences to be able to determine for ourselves and to provide those listeners that are actually listening to this or will listen to this in the future potentially, what is it that we got out of it? So I see that. Well, I said yes and no. I was a little facetious about that. Yes, I think that the revelation, as the last paragraph that I had read about the inhabitants of Urantia, the revelation of the truth about God is certainly going to find its way. It's going to crowd out some of those older superstitions. And I said no because I don't think everyone on the planet is going to read the Urantia book. Certainly not in, the next 100 years or so, that's for sure. But living the spiritual truths of the teachings that we have now been embellished upon from the fourth epochal revelation, I think is then going to start that, how that hope is then going to, actually portray on society that the revelation of the truth about God is appearing, and the human race is destined to know the universal Father and all that beauty and character of the loveliness of attributes. So sorry about being a little equivocal about that necessarily, but I think that's how I have to answer that right now, Neil.
Thank you for your very interesting reply, but you did not address the second sentence in the question, which I will read for you again. Are you willing to predict that any institutional religion whose leaders proclaim Jesus as the Son of God will abandon its core doctrine that he died on the cross to redeem mankind and atone for our sins?
I saw that as a... yeah, I didn't answer that, did I? I got so wrapped up in the first part of it, I didn't answer the second part. I think that the short answer for me is no. I don't think that that's going to happen in the way that the question has been provided. I can't predict how an institution is going to operate. It's when the institution becomes institutional at the spiritual level that these core doctrines will then crowd out. And I don't think that we're going to see too much, at least in our lifetime and maybe for the next few generations after us, that these core doctrines are going to change. So I can't predict that by just proclaiming that Jesus is the Son of God, because I think most of Christianity portrays that already. So I don't think that how the question is stated that I can say yes to that. So I would have to say, no, I'm not willing to predict that that an institution will then abandon its core doctrines which is the atonement doctrine.
Thank you. That is responsive to the second question. I appreciate your additional answer. Steve, your turn.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the teachings of the Urantia book are going to enter the evolutionary stream of historical humanity, and these teachings will be modified accordingly. And so, again, like Bob, the teachings per se that are actually, word for word in the Urantia book, I don't know how many of them will persevere, but I think their effects and their modifications will be absorbed into the historical stream of religious practice and thinking. So that's kind of a yes and a no answer, I would say. And then the second question, I think rather than the leaders of the certain churches abandoning that core doctrine, I think the churches themselves will be abandoned, and they will continue to fade, in significance. So they may hold on to their teachings, but the churches themselves will be abandoned, and we already see that process happening. So to answer the second part of the question, they will not abandon the core doctrine, but they will be abandoned. So.
Thank you. That's an interesting way of putting it. I appreciate your flexibility in paraphrasing the outcome. Doreen?
Sure. And I believe that, everything takes time. Everything that happens in history is built upon what somebody else has done. So I find this, the loveless idea of the sin and the sacrifice is not soul satisfying. And it will be replaced with a message that's dominated by love. And that has to be, so the Spirit will direct the real faith of Jesus's teachings. And that's, of course, joy in the Spirit. Now, I did some searching, and I found that, and I looked upon the idea of the cross, number one, and it led me to a lot of interesting things. And of course, it's the most recognized icon in the world, but it also symbolized military power. And, what I said is that St. John the Divine, which is in Manhattan, has a bronze figure now of a crucifixion of a woman. And I was like, what is going on? So it said that the Christian places of worship, from the liberal Protestant to the conservative mega churches, are all removing the religious symbols. That it's no longer associated, it's associated with oppression, and it's not positive. And they don't want to go to church and see these practices anymore. They hate the idea of guilt and violent death. And there's a move towards spirituality. So I do believe that it's going to take a long time. But it's just like, when you're reading about what, say, Gandhi did. The ideas didn't just come to him of his own self. He built upon others' ideas and then came up with his ideas. And he changed the whole way that his country was able to move forward. So it's just a natural thing. I believe that history has shown us that eventually we'll all move into the understanding, I think, that the Urantia book has resented little by little. And even in China, I think they said they're moving crosses from their churches now because it has dual associations, symbolism, and it isn't something that people accept anymore. So I'm not sure if I answered your question anyway, but there are so many, cultural crosses. And I think there was about 8 or 10 different types of crosses. And even the Pope has 3 lines across, 3, cross bars. And that was another cross. And there was from all the religions. So they all identify with this sin and the sacrifice and hanging on the cross. It's just from one end of culture to another. And it's not really in modern times today. People want to gravitate towards something that's uplifting and filling. And I think in the future it will continue, especially during adverse conditions now.
I appreciate your many interesting remarks. I have trouble quite understanding what I should do with your answer in terms of the net outcome. I suspect that maybe if I interpret it properly, you are saying there will be a continuing evolution and things will change eventually, but you're not willing to predict exactly when or by whom or what the net outcome will be from a perspective of an organized religion. Have I understood you correctly?
Yeah, I think people are gravitating towards smaller groups instead of large institutions. Because again, as I had said, these large mega churches are really entertainment. The people come there because it's fun and it's uplifting and they're happy. People want to be happy. So either the churches have to change the true message of Jesus' teaching, which I believe if you got up and made a sermon about what he said, it's so beautiful. Who wouldn't be happy to be there? And part of it just fills you. It filled me, and I wasn't looking for it. So I have to say, and I can't understand how it wouldn't touch everyone's soul to be filled with that love and inspiration for eternal future, what's going to happen to us, because everybody's searching for that. That's one thing that's important.
Thank you. I would like to add a point of view, a specific idea that comes out of my own reading about China. As most of you know, I studied the Chinese language, the Mandarin Chinese, during my career with the State Department. And part of that included a study of Chinese politics. In addition, I served for 3 years in Hong Kong in the American consulate there. So from time to time, I watch trends in China on a political level simply by continuation of my lifelong interest. I also watch religious trends in China. And the reason I'm intervening now is because of your statement that in China, the cross is being removed. Well, maybe so, but I would point to a different motive. The communist government of China looks at the cross as a political symbol of organized groups that are not necessarily putting their faith in the Communist Party. In other words, they look at the cross as a symbol of influence and attention to something other than the regime. And therefore, there is political pressure to remove the cross. And in some cases, there have been official acts that tore a cross down for the political reason that I've just described. Marvin, it's your turn to go at question 61.
Thanks, Neil. So I'm looking at your question 61. I'm just going to read it again to help refocus. When the divine counselor declares that, quote, the inhabitants of Urantia are to find deliverance from these ancient errors, unquote, is he essentially predicting that most human beings will eventually accept the teachings of the Urantia book? So I'm going to respond to that first and then the second question. Yes, I think eventually most human beings will eventually accept the teachings of the Urantia book. If you're talking about eventually being into the eras of light and life, I'd say the large majority will. And even at that far point in time, they'll probably recognize that it came originally. One of the sources it came through was the Urantia book. as a series of ongoing revelations. In the more near term, I think more people might accept the teachings of the Urantia book without any recognition of the Urantia book itself as a source. And there's a theme running through this that I think Steve was trying to allude to, and I think Doreen as well, and that is the interaction of our evolutionary efforts and revelation, and our efforts springing from revelation. And in that regard, before I go to the second question, I want to share a quote that I find very interesting, and it's in the Melchizedek papers, and it's very simple. They're talking about the followers of Melchizedek, and how Melchizedek was trying to teach simple salvation by faith, which obviously did not require anyone's sacrifice. And the statement they make is, but even such a short and simple declaration of faith was altogether too much and too advanced for the men of those days. They simply could not grasp the idea of getting divine favor for nothing, by faith. They were too deeply confirmed in the belief that man was born under forfeit to the gods. And that's 93.4.5, paper 93, section 4, paragraph 5. A very interesting statement. And what they're talking about there is the interaction of revelation and evolutionary phenomenon and human beings' basic psychological struggle. And there's a fact there, and that is human beings are painfully aware of in Christianity, they call it the fallen condition. In the Urantia book context, I would call it our partial evolution, our incompletion, our primitive status as evolving children of God. And it's part of our nature. God made us down at the bottom of existence. And human beings struggle with how to reconcile the divine and perfect nature of God with our broken nature, our partial nature. It's a universal struggle. It's a psychological struggle, and it's real, and it has validity. And what they're saying is those people, and I think many people today, can't simply accept that God would accept us in our broken state simply by our faith. And I think part of the problem is most people have a very simplistic and superficial understanding of what the term faith means. It's not simple belief in something. Faith, if you understand it in the context of the Urantia book, is a profound loyalty and conviction to the highest spiritual truths such that you try to live them out. That's not nothing. That's a huge something. And if people understood that that's what faith really is, and if they tried to exercise faith in that way, they would reconcile that problem of their broken nature, because the healing of the broken nature comes from our devotion to these higher spiritual relationships and our reclamation and our transformation as a result of our in-depth involvement with God, which is what our faith leads to. So this leads me to your last question, which I think is really interestingly phrased. Are you willing to predict that any institution or religion whose leaders proclaim Jesus as the Son of God will abandon its core doctrine that he died on the cross to redeem mankind and atone for our sins? And I think your two questions are very related. I think the most profound and impactful issue around the Urantia book is what we as devotees of these teachings, readers of the Urantia book, what we are going to do evolutionarily with this revelatory impact. What are we going to do with it, which is a profound evolutionary phenomenon? And if we seriously address ourselves to taking the core spiritual truths and reaching out to the broader culture, then I do think that many people will find salvation through faith alone and will abandon the idea of a sacrificial doctrine. My sense is in the evolutionary outworking of all that, I sort of agree with Steve, most established Christian denominations will not voluntarily let go of their belief, the sacrificial need of Jesus dying on the cross. I think people will leave those churches and form new churches or form new sects, and we will have entirely new movements of our own flowing from the Urantia revelation, I hope. that teach the higher spiritual teachings and form institutions and organized efforts, because otherwise things don't spread effectively. So I think you're going to see all of the above, but most of the institutions will hang on to their views, and other institutions will split off and evolve, some Christian and some more broad and generic.
At the risk of simplifying your answer, perhaps to a degree that you will find it unrecognizable, I think you have said that there will be a favorable movement, a favorable evolution of society, and that the higher teachings, the higher ideals of the Urantia book will eventually prevail, although no one can know how long it will take. Am I largely correct in my general view here?
With one qualification,
Yes.
and that is, you're saying that will generally happen, and I'm saying it will or it won't, depending on whether we shoulder the mantle of our responsibility with these teachings to develop evolutionary movements that accomplish that purpose. That's
I was striving to summarize what you had just said. Those are not views of mine, and I think that you have added a useful clarification.
Yeah, thanks.
Bob, you are recognized. I'm sorry, you're asking to be recognized?
Yes, if I could just segue off of what Marvin said, because he segued off of Steve a little bit. The causality for me, and number two, I didn't mention this when I responded to the second question. It seems to me that the causality is already occurring in our society, and we talk a little bit about our backgrounds and our experiences. Well, mine's been in business, of course, for 40 plus years, and 10 of teaching. And I see the causality in business with this idea called non-attributional. And that came out of the quality movement, by the way, where, the Dr. Demings and the Durans taught businesses that don't scapegoat the individual. And I'm kind of leading that scapegoating is very similar to atonement. If our society operates with this whole atonement idea, scapegoating turns to be part and parcel of, well, it's what I'm being taught. It's built interstitially. Well, with this quality movement, we've taken some very large movements, very large corporate institutions, and moved the attribution from the individual and taken it away from it. There's many examples. So I see the causality not coming off the religious institution, but potentially moving from the secular institution with this almost a high value concept. I'm not going to call it spiritual, but I'll call it high value. And as those things start to permeate our society, I think that we're going to see those affecting those religious institutions.
Thank you, Steve. You wanted to add?
Yeah, I'll just add briefly that, there are resources in Christianity. There are 4 models of the atonement doctrine. And if the leaders of institutionalized churches wanted to, they could appropriate one or more of those traditions to slowly evolve out of their current status, which is what's called a penal substitution model of atonement. There are 3 or 4 others that are a lot more progressive and a lot more full of love, you might say, as to why Jesus came here and died on Urantia. So there are resources in Urantia, in Christianity. The question is, will they appropriate them to make slow evolutionary changes within Christianity in time to avoid being abandoned by the general population? So we'll see.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I would like now to take an opportunity that I seldom exercise in order to respond to part of the overtones that Bob gave us just a little while ago. The phrase non-attributional can be looked at from different directions. I am a little bit uncomfortable with it if the direction that it takes is the idea that people are not responsible for their actions or decisions. The teachings of the Urantia book emphasize the moral consequences of our decisions. The revelators tell us that the soul is constructed from these moral consequences. So if the concept of non-attributional means that one absolves oneself from one's personal decisions by melding them into the overall conduct of some group, well, I'm extremely uncomfortable with that. We have to stand for personal responsibility. Now, on the other hand, if the consequence of non-attribution is to avoid unnecessarily personalizing blame and attacking people's character for something that may not be their fault, well, then I agree with that. But the concept of personal choice and personal responsibility is one of the very deep ideas that the Revelators have emphasized, and indeed they have portrayed that as the key point, as the key ingredient that causes the soul to evolve in the Varancha level. So, Bob, I don't know if you want to come back on this or whether you're content with what I have just said. I don't think I really contradicted anything you said, but I may have taken aim at an implication of some people's interpretation of non-attributional that I do not accept.
Yeah, let me just follow up with that. The term non-attributional in business, anyway, is based upon how the system is operating with the individuals. Dr. Deming was probably the one that furthered this the most. It was the most difficult thing for U.S. Corporations to understand and implement for various reasons. So it's really how the individual operates with the system. You know, the individual is, well, theoretically, according to Deming, 95% of the individuals come to work to do a good job. So they're taking on personal responsibility in their daily jobs. It's the system that doesn't allow them to operate in ways that they don't deserve the attribution for the problem that may have occurred in the business. So yes, I totally agree with you. Personal responsibility and is something that we should be teaching. But when you're interacting with the system, it's much different.
I'm content with that. Shall I assume now that we have reached a point where it does make sense to continue on with the text on the top of page 93, which starts talking about the implications of certain teachings associated with Christianity pertaining to women that were not uniformly positive? If I see no objection, I will then do that. Marvin, do you have the page in front of you, or can you get it in front of you, page 93?
Yes, I do.
Okay, would you read the introductory point, highlighted the perils of Pauline, and then the two short quotations that follow it?
Yep. C, the perils of Pauline. Another serious defect of the teachings of the Apostle Paul stemmed from his personal disregard for women, combined with his tendency to downgrade their spiritual role or even deny it entirely. For example, here are two excerpts from epistles of the New Testament that Christian tradition ascribes to Paul. The first is from Corinthians chapter 14, verses 33 to 35, Revised Standard Version. As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silence in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as even the law says. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. And the second quote from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 to 12. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Also that women should adorn themselves modestly and sensibly in seemly apparel, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly attire, but by good deeds, as befits women who profess religion. Let a woman learn in silence with all submissiveness. I permit no woman to teach or have authority over men. She is to keep silent. And that's that.
I think that these two excerpts leave me with the impression that Paul did not understand women very well. To advocate that women be silent, in my opinion, is a denial of the right to contribute ideas and inspirations on the part of half of the human race. And also the idea that women are going to be silent seems to me to betray a lack of understanding of human nature. Steve, would you like to come in on these ideas and these quotations and the overall implications they may have for you?
Okay. So regarding First Timothy, that's almost universally, there's a universal consensus among scholars that First Timothy was not written by Paul. It was written by one of the followers of Paul. So I'm just going to disregard that one from the get-go. Now, as far as the statement from First Corinthians, it needs to be taken in the context of all of Paul's writings. Paul mentions at least 10 women as either disciples or apostles of Jesus with great familiarity and affection for these women and respect for these women. So there's disagreement about this among current scholarship, but there are scholars who believe that these couple of verses were interpolated later by followers of Paul, since this kind of attitude is much more similar to what you see in First Timothy, written by one of his followers, than it is similar to the rest of Paul's writings. So just to put out the idea that this is not engraved in stone anywhere, this is an idea that's under conversation among scholars, and it's not cut and dried. That Paul was had these attitudes about women.
Let me push you a little bit on your response. I believe that your analysis of the possible authorship or lack of clear proof of authorship is a valid one from what I understand, that my readings into the Christian tradition and scholarship pertaining to it have not been as extensive as yours. But if we move on to the contents, it is fair to say that both of these epistles were part of the Christian tradition, and for most of the 2,000 years, they were accepted as valid teachings.
I would say that it's Christianity is part of general culture, and these are cultural attitudes that Christianity partook in and reflected. So early Christianity was much more open to women. Of course, Jesus was very much more appreciative and supportive of women. But as soon as Christianity entered the general culture, it started to be permeated by that. And so I would not say this is a Christian attitude as much as it is a general cultural attitude of the time.
Thank you. Marvin?
I think there's a danger in how we're talking about, because the implication here is in the title of the section, The Perils of Pauline, which is kind of cute. But I think the implication is that we're looking critically at Christianity as a misogynistic religious institution. And I think there's a peril in that, because Christianity is not a monolithic reality. Culturally, it's extremely diverse. There are how many billion Christians and how many hundreds and hundreds of denominations. And Christianity is an evolving institution culturally. It's constantly in a process of change and evolution. So I'd make the observation that Paul was a good Jew of his time, and the Jews of that time, and even the Orthodox Jews of today, in their prayer time, give thanks to God, I think 6 times or something in their morning prayers, that God did not create them a woman. You know, that Orthodox men are or there's misogyny woven into Jewish culture and into frankly almost all the traditional religious cultures of the world. And it's a matter of conservative, traditional, cultural factors. I'd make the observation that there are many Christian denominations now who are at the forefront of this set of issues. The Episcopal Church is just one that ordains women, and women have moved up to the highest levels of leadership in the church. The same thing is true with the Methodist Church and a number of other Christian denominations. So Christianity, as is Judaism, as is Islam, as is every other major religious institution, is a vast cultural reality with conservative, moderate, and more liberal elements. And the moderate and more liberal elements in most of these religions are moving along with the general culture to upstep the role and understanding of the equality of women and try to incorporate it into their structures. It's an ongoing evolutionary struggle. So I just would make that observation. Christianity is among them.
Thank you. Doreen, your turn. You have to unmute yourself there. Okay.
Oh, I'm muted? Am I
No,
muted?
you're unmuted. Yes, you're fine.
Oh, I never touched it. Anyway, it's really interesting because when you're talking about women being treated better, I think there are a lot of movements where women now are in higher places in the different religions. But Islam, I don't think so. First of all, women must cover themselves, right? Because of their beauty, the church says. And Judaism, I mean, I went to services and they had a curtain up between the men and the women. And I said, what for? You're not allowed to touch the Torah. You weren't allowed to do whatever, sing or say whatever. You had to do it silently on the other side. It was the most bizarrest thing. And I remember Jesus even said, why are men and women, worship is segregated? And he was young when he said it. He realized this is absurd. But what's happening all over the world? Even when I traveled, I saw women were separated on the balconies, in many, many of the institutions. The men were downstairs, the women were upstairs. They said they have to wear things on their heads so men are not distracted by their beauty. The church kind of then paid, they placed a high value on virginity more than marriage. In the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, they established a tradition of associating sexuality with sin. So to say that the fathers thought of women as the gateway to the devil, they had no self-control, so they blamed the women. And I've heard numerous stories that went on, and it wasn't good from nuns even. But I want to say something about women. Now, they said in the parliament, they gave a lot of information on women. And they said 43% of the farmers in Haiti are women on the small farms. And the same now I have a friend that works in the Syrian tent cities in Lebanon. And the women and the little children are only allowed to work in the fields, not the men. They have a high premium on women. They have more freedom, but the men are not. And they use them, of course, as if slave labor. And this because the tents are on people who own the land, their farms. So they set up these tents. And they said in Afghanistan, women are not allowed education. They beat them and cover their mouths so they can't scream. They're worthless. 8-year-olds, I told you last time, are married to 40-year-old men. So it's like there's slavery here for the girls. There really is. And to talk about what's going on today as a result of primitive times, no, I think it was a carryover from Judaism, where the women were not treated equal. And even in my time, I would say earlier, women were supposed to stay in the home and you don't get educated. And very few people did of the old generations. So I don't know where it's going, but it's better because they said now in India, they're educating the girls. And they're not, they're allowing them now to marry at 18 instead of 8 or 10 or 12. So they said through social, education of giving them understanding of how to function in society, things have gotten better. But it is a very slow process. And women have taken their place in a lot of areas, but I think the Catholic Church is still discussing this. They've been discussing it for a long time. So I find that there's a long way to go. And there has this, besides, the one thing that I didn't understand was praying to the saints to intercede, on a person's behalf with God. That to me was kind of, I just mentioned it because it was on my mind, why that is necessary when, of course, we know better today. And they're still looking to anoint more saints. And they said, did you ever see a happily married saint? I don't know. So I don't think so. Anyway, but there are women that they are accounting for saints these days. They're evaluating them. And I don't know if that's better or not. I really don't. But there is terrible, terrible injustice in the world, without a doubt. And there's numerous stories, but there's no time to tell you. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you. I believe that the truths that the revelators have shared with us in the Urantia book certainly include the important point that each human being is equally indwelled by a thought adjuster, having reached the age of moral discernment, and that the thought adjuster is a fragment of God the Father that does not depend upon the sex of the individual person whose mind the thought adjuster lives in, that the ministry of the angels, the seraphim, the ministry of the Spirit of Truth, the ministry of the Holy Spirit, are all entirely unrelated to the difference between men and women, and that spiritually we are all equals. Enough of my own personal views. Bob, your turn.
Sure, thanks, Neil. These two paragraphs that came out of the revised standard version in Corinthians certainly portray what was the cultural norm of the first century. However, again, I'm going to go back to process. There is a process, and I think everybody has said that there's a process between evolution and revelation, and also culture. The culture here drove into the religion and theology of the time. And then there's a very interesting, if we look over the history of, the couple thousand years, we see the reinforcing of this as the word became infallible. I mean, it went from an infallible individual to an infallible book. The infallibility concept then makes these drive back into the culture as the culture was changing. So fast forward to today, Doreen's spoken very well about, we have a mixed culture for sure, but, at least here in North America, what we're seeing, or I should say in the West, maybe probably a better way to say that, what we're seeing is that the culture now is changing. And this may be affecting the theology in a way that those two paragraphs are not infallible anymore. And there's a realization I'm certain of that this just doesn't work. We can't operate this way today, no matter where we are, either in secular or in religious societies. So these two paragraphs are very interesting. I think everyone has spoken about how they affect the culture, but I see the culture and the interweaving of this with the religiosity of it to be very interesting. And I think that there's the jury's out, so to speak, as to how that's going to really wind up. What do you do? Do you just ignore this? In many cases, yes. Over.
I would try to answer your question. We cannot ignore it as a reality. We must do our best to improve the practices of the world that we live in, on the understanding that these evolutionary changes do take time. That's why they are called evolutionary. Steve, I think you just motioned that you would like to speak again.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate that subjection and abuse of women is not a religious phenomenon. It's not a secular phenomenon. It's a cultural or social phenomenon reflected by religion. I don't think that there's a case to be made that religion caused or causes subjection of women. It's not a coincidence that the Me Too movement is at the simultaneous with the investigation and rejection of priests in the Catholic Church. So you have a secular phenomenon going hand in hand with a religious phenomenon, and those two both reflect generic changes in the culture. So I don't agree that religion causes these things. It reflects these things in the general culture, much less St. Paul.
Thank you. I would like to add one point that correlates with what I have heard and read about the Islamic tradition. I believe that there are reasons to accept the view that the role of women in Islamic societies is severely curtailed. But there is one point on which I may be able to add a certain amount of information, and that has to do with the custom of wearing the head-to-toe garment called the burqa in some context and the niqab in others. It's the same thing, a black garment covering the head, leaving a slit for the eyes and reaching all the way to the feet. I have talked to several Islamic believers, most of whom were fellow diplomats during my service overseas, and they emphasized that that custom of that garb is not a religious custom. It is a social custom pertaining to the circumstances of particular societies that favor that tradition. And it is a very limiting tradition, I will accept. That, for example, there are quite a few countries that are Islamic in their religious views in which this garb is not required. Indonesia being a notable example. Egypt is another place that is predominantly Islamic in which the burqa or niqab is not required. So simply for the information of those who may have unwisely associated that method of clothing with the teachings of the Islamic faith, it is not true. That is purely a social custom. Now, Marvin, I think you were asking for further comments. Yes.
Yeah, I'll simply amplify a little on your statement about Islam. One of our two daughters married a Muslim man and has converted to Islam. And so have gotten increasingly familiar with Algerian society, which is an Islamic society. And I work as the executive director of the Interfaith Council here in Las Vegas, and have gotten to be very dear friends with a number of Muslim women, and have multiple conversations about this. And what I'll say is the situation in Islam is really, it is a little different than Christianity, but not much different. Both traditions have scriptural texts that emphasize the inferiority of women in their functional roles, and other texts that I think emphasize the value of women and the prominence of women. In numerous Muslim societies, women are highly regarded professionals, and in greater degree than in some Western societies. So it really varies by culture. The other thing that I'll say is that I think both Christianity and Islam are in the midst of very powerful evolutionary struggles with the issue of the role of women in society and the role of women in religious function. And in America, and particularly American Muslims, are there's dramatic evolution in the role and function of women in American Islam as there is in Christianity. So I just simply make the point that we speak of these religions as monolithic, static realities, and they are not. They're extremely diverse in many different cultures, and they are in a profound state of evolutionary ferment, many of them, on this issue and on many other issues.
Thank you, Marvin. That was very helpful. I would add that there is a tendency among many citizens of the United States, I'll try to say that in a non-evaluative way, to treat the example of Saudi Arabia as a paradigm that applies to Islam in general, which is not the case. The practices of Saudi Arabia are associated with a very severe understanding of the teachings of Islam called Wahhabi. And their social customs in regard to women are a part of that tradition. They are not a characteristic of Islam as a whole. I think, Doreen, you have asked for additional comments.
Yeah, when I was at the university and I had a class on this, and they mentioned that it's a choice of women to wear the garb many times because they don't want to be different. It's like you want to fit in, that people will talk about you. And they said the same with having a driver. Instead of them driving, they have a driver take them where they want to go. It is, again, a stigma. They will be different. They'll stand out. So many times they choose not to take the higher road and just fit in. But there is a very large movement throughout the world now with women getting educated and moving on and taking their place. And they call it not theism, but weism. So I thought that was really cute. So they have an identity, and it'll take a long time, but I think it's moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Marvin.
I'll try to be brief. I think threaded through this conversation, there's a very important distinction, and that is especially with these multinational religions like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, certainly, Buddhism, not so much Hinduism, but Buddhism. There's an incredible spectrum in any of these religious institutions on a global sense. There are conservative traditional elements, there are moderate middle ground elements, and there are liberal evolving elements. So for instance, in the Muslim tradition, just as an example, you've got the Sufi tradition, which is more at the liberal and mystical end of Islam. So I think it's really important, and that's true in Christianity as well. You've got a liberal, moderate, and very conservative Christian functions. And the conservatives in Christianity and in Islam and in Judaism and in Buddhism and in Hinduism bear much more similar sociological characteristics than they are different. It really has more to do with conservatism and traditionalism versus more liberal and innovative thinking within the vast traditions that we're talking about.
Thank you. If I could first agree with what you've said and perhaps try to express it in a very general way, there seems to be a consensus with which I would associate your remarks that these issues pertaining to the role and status of women are more a matter of sociology and social trends than they are a matter of theology, the religion itself. And that as a matter of sociology and social trends, we can hope, we can believe that the situation will continue to improve with efforts on all our parts. Doreen, did I see you asking for additional remarks? No. All right. You're muted. I can't hear you, but I take that as a no.
Wait a minute. I didn't mute. I didn't mute myself. Bob muted me.
Yeah, I did.
It's him.
We each of us need a button on our screen to mute Bob.
Well, I will say that the quality of the recording overall will really benefit if we keep ourselves muted unless we speak, because there's a lot of extraneous noise that's getting recorded.
You hear it? I don't hear anything.
Yeah, no, it's coming. That's why Bob muted you, Doreen, because there's a lot of.
From me?
Yeah, the microphones, there are idiosyncrasies of the microphones in your systems, and they'll just pick up all kinds of extraneous noise and give feedback loops. So really best to mute unless you're speaking if you can.
I thought maybe I was snoring, so. But
Well,
anyway.
I don't understand whether this extraneous noise was coming from you when you were not speaking or when you were.
Wait a minute. Is that a compliment or an insult?
I'm just teasing you. That was in an effort to be humorous, but I have to assure you that I did not mean it seriously.
Well, coming from a female, I think the burqa is great. You don't have to do your hair or put makeup on or worry about what to wear. It really saves a lot of time. So I was thinking about it myself.
Well, I was also thinking about your example of women who like to be driven around by drivers, and I was just going
I would love it.
if I have a group of women who want to come drive me around, I certainly would not object to that.
Well, and there are definitely days when I've considered wearing a burqa myself.
It might get you past the security guard in the atrium of some skyscraper, I suppose.
So cute. But quickly, what I just wanted to say, a personal experience, I was sitting on an airplane and there was this Islamic Muslim woman sitting next to me with her two children. And we were having a wonderful conversation. I was telling her about, the teachings, and she was very interested in hearing about it. And then at some point, her husband came over and said, "You better come and sit with me." He thought, she's getting out too much information he didn't want. And he was a doctor. And so, and he lived right here in Texas, I think. So there's a lot of mixture here in the States as well. It's not all women have freedom. I used to go on the train at night, and there were the girls, they took off the hijabs and they were going out dancing. And I said, "What?" "Oh," they said, we love your culture, but they can't do, they have to lie about it. And just do it at midnight or whatever. Anyway, I'll stop. Thank you very much, Neil.
Well, thank you, Doreen, for the friendly and humorous spirit that you've accepted this discussion. I would now like to go on. I'm hesitant a little bit because we have not quite reached the 2-hour mark, but we're coming close. I believe that it is best to ask that the long quotation at the bottom of page 93 be read and let it sort of exist in our memory, and then we'll have to discuss the concept of celibacy and what it entails at our next occasion. But for the sake of the concluding minutes of this program, I'd like to turn to Bob and ask Bob to read the introductory statement in the middle of page 93, and then the long quotation by a brilliant evening star that follows it.
Sure, will do, Neil. Thank you. In addition, Paul promoted celibacy, another highly unfortunate theme of his. Here is the trenchant analysis that we owe to a brilliant evening star. It was only natural that the cult of renunciation and humiliation should have paid attention to sexual gratification. The continence cult originated as a ritual among soldiers prior to engaging in battle. In later days, it became the practice of saints. This cult tolerated marriage only as an evil lesser than fornication. Many of the world's great religions have been adversely influenced by this ancient cult, but none more markedly than Christianity. The Apostle Paul was a devotee of this cult, and his personal views are reflected in the teachings which he fastened onto Christian theology. It's good for a man not to touch a woman. I would that all men were even as I myself. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them to abide even as I. Paul well knew that such teachings were not a part of Jesus' gospel, and his acknowledgement of this is illustrated by his statement, I speak this by permission and not by commandment. But this cult led Paul to look down upon women. And the pity of it all is that his personal opinions have long influenced the teachings of a great world religion. If the advice of the tent maker teacher were to be literally and universally obeyed, then would the human race come to a sudden and inglorious end. Furthermore, the involvement of a religion with the ancient continence cult leads directly to a war against marriage in the home. Society is a veritable foundation and the basic institution of human progress. And it is not to be wondered that all such beliefs fostered the formation of celibate priesthoods in the many religions of various peoples. A Brilliant Evening Star from paper 89, section 3, paragraph 6.
Thank you. I believe that there are many elements in this quotation that we will want to examine, and that for today we should just leave it there and think about it over the ensuing time. The ensuing time, unfortunately, has not yet been determined. As I stated in my introductory remarks, we plan to resume in January, but have not yet selected the precise date. So those of you participating today have quite a bit of time. It may even be as long as a month to meditate upon this paragraph and think about your comments concerning it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I greatly appreciate your participation. I think we've had a very interesting discussion. It has not been and will not be our goal to demonstrate unanimity. Our goal instead is to demonstrate pluralism and diversity, and I believe we have done that today. So let me recognize each of you for concluding remarks in the event that you wish to say something, Doreen.
I hope you understood what I said, because I know it's hard to paraphrase when I'm all over the place sometimes. And I know that's women. We think of multiple things at the same time. So I apologize if it's a little challenging, but I can't, that's me. And I thank you anyway for all that you have done, and wish you a wonderful holiday.
Thank you. Concluding remarks, Marvin, if you want to unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And I'll conclude by saying I really appreciate this context and the venue and all of your thorough and hard work, Neil, to structure a situation with exposure to materials that allows us to have some of these very fertile, so to speak, and while we're in the midst of this discussion about continents, discussion about the teachings of the Urantia book. So thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and exit now. I love you guys and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Marvin.
Have another holiday.
I will say that you make a major contribution to the interesting ideas that we've been exchanging.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Steve, your turn for concluding remarks.
Well, I appreciate these opportunities. These are my two favorite subjects, the Urantia book and Christianity. So I'm in hog heaven here. Christianity led me to the Urantia book, and the Urantia book led me to Christianity. So those two, for me, are very well entwined. And so I'm glad to be here and appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we thank you for your many ideas and contributions. Bob, you now have the chance at the final remarks before we sign off for the day.
Yeah, we've gone through a theme of evolutionary to revelation, and I think we're all products of our evolutionary background. As you gave a wonderful story, Neil, yourself, and again, like has been said, I appreciate having to do the hard work to get prepared for this is definitely worth it, and having the diversity of the opinions helped me think through and reflect on some things that are just great to think about. So appreciate this.
Thank you. Goodbye for now.
Bye.
Bye.